Chapter 1. The Beginnings, Colonial Naval Forces and the War of Independence. Before the United States established its own navy, the role of naval forces in North America was rather provisional and closely linked to the interests of the individual colonies. The early settlers in New England, Virginia, and the southern colonies were not only faced with the task of opening up land and asserting themselves against indigenous tribes, but also of securing their trade routes against pirates, smugglers, and rival colonial powers such as Spain, France, or the Netherlands. Each colony pursued its own strategies. Massachusetts built the first armed ships in the 17th century to curb piracy in the Atlantic. Rhode Island and Connecticut used similar small fleets. These ships were not warships in the modern sense, but armed merchant ships that were equipped for defense if necessary. The importance of seafaring for the colonies grew rapidly. Trade with Europe, the Caribbean, and Africa was essential for survival, and the colonial economy relied on the transportation of goods such as tobacco, cotton, sugar, and rum. But these trade routes were dangerous. Pirates from the Caribbean, buccaneers on behalf of European powers, and enemy colonial armies threatened shipping. Without the protection of the British Royal Navy, the colonies would have been far more endangered. In fact, it was the presence of the British fleet that saved the colonies from major attacks by Spain or France. As relations between the colonies and Britain deteriorated in the 1760s and 1770s, dependence on the Royal Navy became a problem. The British controlled the ports, blocked trade routes, and used their naval power to enforce tariffs and trade restrictions. For many colonists, it became clear that without their own naval forces, a fight for independence against the empire could hardly be won. With the beginning of the American War of Independence in 1775, the rebels faced a formidable challenge. Britain had the strongest navy in the world, while the colonists had neither a unified fleet nor the necessary infrastructure. Nevertheless, steps were taken quickly. As early as October 1775, the Continental Congress decided to create a small fleet which became known as the Continental Navy. Among the first ships acquired were the converted merchant ships Alfred, Andrew Doria, Columbus, and Cabot. They were lightly armed and were mainly used to capture British supply ships and disrupt supply routes. A central head of the early Navy was Essex Hopkins, the first commander-in-chief. Under his leadership, the Continental Navy undertook its first expedition against Nassau in the Bahamas, where it captured much-needed gunpowder and weapons. Even though the Continental Navy was weak in numbers, its commanders succeeded in significantly disrupting British logistics through daring operations. A decisive figure was John Paul Jones, probably the most famous captain of the Continental Navy. His bold attack on British coastal cities and the legendary victory of Bonhomme Richard over the British frigate Serapis in 1779 made him a hero and symbol of the American spirit of resistance. His famous exclamation, "I have not yet begun to fight," reflected the determination that went far beyond the actual military significance. In addition to the official Navy, privateers, that is, private privateers on behalf of Congress, also played an important role. Hundreds of American ships received letters of capture and attacked British merchant ships. They captured valuable goods, weakened the British economy, and brought in urgently needed supplies for the rebels. Privateering was risky but profitable, and it complemented the modest resources of the Continental Navy. But the American rebels could hardly have won the war at sea without the help of France. With the French alliance of 1778, a powerful navy came into play, which shifted the balance of power. The French fleet blockaded British ports and supported crucial operations such as the Siege of Yorktown in 1781. There, the Battle of the Chesapeake Bay contributed significantly to forcing the British troops to surrender. After the Revolutionary War, the Continental Navy largely disbanded. The young United States faced pressing financial problems, and many politicians were skeptical of an expensive navy, which meant a permanent standing force. The few remaining ships were sold or decommissioned. This marked the end of the first phase of the U.S. Navy. a provisional arrangement that arose in an emergency situation but had contributed decisively to the victory. The early colonial naval forces and the Continental Navy were neither technically nor numerically comparable to the Royal Navy, but its importance lay in the demonstration of determination, flexibility, and daring. The colonists proved that they were capable of fighting at sea, even if they did not have the same resources as their opponent. They laid the foundation for the self-image of the later United States Navy, a force that could act innovatively and effectively even under adverse circumstances. Chapter 2. Founding of the United States Navy in 1794 and the First Frigates. After the victory in the War of Independence, the United States was faced with a dilemma. On the one hand, they had learned how important naval forces were in the fight against British superiority and in the protection of trade. On the other hand, many politicians distrusted the idea of a standing fleet. They feared that a powerful navy would not only cause enormous costs, but could also drag the young republic into unnecessary conflicts. As a result, the Continental Navy was virtually disbanded after 1783. For several years, the U.S. had no navy to speak of. However, this phase proved to be dangerous. American merchant ships sailing to Europe, the Caribbean, or the African coast were unprotected. Particularly feared were the Barbary corsairs from North Africa, who captured American ships in the Mediterranean and sold their crews into slavery. While the European powers protected themselves with tribute payments or their own fleets, the USA was too weak to defend its interests. Numerous American sailors were taken prisoner, and the young United States had to engage in costly negotiations to get them free. In 1794, Congress passed the Naval Act of 1794, which laid the foundation for a new fleet. This law provided for the construction of 6 large frigates that would form the backbone of the newly formed United States Navy. This re-established the Navy as a permanent institution. The 6 planned ships were the United States, the Constellation, the Constitution, the President, the Congress, and the Chesapeake. They were to be larger and stronger than most contemporary frigates, but faster and more maneuverable than cumbersome ships of the line. This concept originated with naval architect Joshua Humphreys, who designed the ships as super frigates. They carried heavier guns than usual and could take on smaller ships while escaping larger opponents through their speed. The most famous of these frigates is undoubtedly the USS Constitution, which was nicknamed Old Ironsides. It would become famous during the War of 1812 when British cannonballs bounced off its thick oak planks as if they were made of iron. But even its commissioning in 1797 symbolized the USA's claim to be taken seriously on the world's oceans. The young officers of the Navy had to organize themselves from the ground up. There was no long tradition like in the Royal Navy, and the training was often improvised. Many commanders still came from the Continental Navy or had gained experience in the War of Independence. Discipline, seamanship, and tactical knowledge had to be built up step by step. The first deployments of the new Navy took place as part of the Quasi-War with France, 1798 to 1800. The background was that the French government attacked American merchant ships after the USA had officially remained neutral in the conflict between Great Britain and France, but at the same time concluded trade agreements with the British. The U.S. Navy sent its new frigates to the Caribbean, where they intercepted numerous French privateers and protected convoys. The USS Constellation gained particular fame when she captured the French frigate L'Insurgente in a battle in 1799. These early successes greatly increased the reputation of the Navy. For the first time, the young fleet proved that it was capable of effectively defending American trade interests. At the same time, however, the challenges also became apparent. The costs of maintaining the ships were high, and there were repeated debates in Congress as to whether a large fleet was really necessary. President Thomas Jefferson, who took office in 1801, initially believed that small, inexpensive gunboats would be sufficient for coastal defense. But he was soon to experience that a powerful fleet was indispensable. The real test of the new Navy came in the Barbary Wars from 1801 onwards, when American ships continued to be threatened by pirate states such as Tripoli. Instead of paying high tributes, Jefferson sent the Navy to the Mediterranean. There, the U.S. frigates fought in difficult battles, carried out blockades, and undertook daring landing operations. In particular, the efforts of Stephen Decatur, who destroyed the pirate-captured ship USS Philadelphia in Tripoli in 1804, became legendary and made him a national hero. These successes strengthened the Navy's self-confidence and proved that the United States was able to assert its interests on the international stage. The founding of the Navy in 1794 was thus much more than just a reaction to the immediate threat of corsairs. It was a decisive step on the USA's path to maritime power. The 6 Humphreys frigates formed not only the material foundation, but also the symbolic core of a fleet that from the very beginning had the claim to be modern, flexible, and combat-strong. At the end of the 18th century, the United States Navy was still small compared to the established maritime powers, but it had already proven that it could fight on an equal footing. The first frigates established a tradition that still shapes the Navy's self-image today: technological innovation, tactical adaptability, and the will to be present on the oceans even as a young nation. Chapter 3. Early Conflicts, Quasi-War with France, and the Barbary Wars. The first decades after the founding of the United States Navy were marked by tests to show whether the new fleet could live up to the high expectations. Shortly after its re-establishment in 1794, the young naval force was embroiled in a series of international conflicts that justified its existence and sharpened its profile as an indispensable instrument of foreign policy. In particular, the Quasi-War with France, 1798–1800, and the conflicts with the Barbary states of North Africa, 1801–1815, were decisive touchstones. The Quasi-War was an unofficial, undeclared naval war between the United States and France. The trigger was the tense situation in Europe after the French Revolution and the Revolutionary Wars. The USA had concluded a trade treaty with Great Britain in 1794, which France saw as a betrayal. French privateers then began to seize American merchant ships in the Caribbean and the Atlantic. Since the United States did not have a strong fleet, its trade was massively threatened. Congress responded by rearming the Navy in 1798 and accelerating shipbuilding. President John Adams, although he himself preferred a peace-oriented policy, was forced to deploy the Navy. In the following 2 years, American frigates operated in the Caribbean and achieved important victories. The USS Constellation, in particular, made a name for itself when it captured the French frigate L'Insurgente and damaged La Vengeance in a heavy battle. These successes showed that the Humphreys frigates were up to the European ships. The Quasi-War ended in 1800 with the Treaty of Mortefontaine, which diffused tensions. But the experience had clearly demonstrated the importance of the Navy. Without it, the United States would have been susceptible to blackmail. Its trade would have collapsed. The war gave the fleet prestige and international recognition for the first time. No sooner had this conflict ended than the Navy faced a new challenge: the Barbary Wars. The so-called Barbary states, Tripoli, Algiers, Tunis, and Morocco, lived to a large extent from piracy and extortion. They hijacked merchant ships, abducted crews, and demanded high tributes so that their ships would be spared. Many European powers had agreed to this and regularly paid protection money. The USA had also initially paid tributes after independence, as it was vulnerable without British protection. President Thomas Jefferson, however, wanted to put an end to this practice. When the Pasha of Tripoli demanded higher payments in 1801 and the United States refused, he declared war on the United States. This marked the beginning of the First Barbary War, 1801 to 1805, which led the Navy into the Mediterranean. The fighting was hard and demanded everything from the young officers. American frigates blocked ports, shelled coastal towns, and tried to curb piracy. A dramatic event was the loss of the USS Philadelphia in 1803, which ran aground off Tripoli and was captured by the Tripolitans. This would have made it a dangerous weapon against the USA. But the young officer Stephen Deckard carried out a daring operation. He entered the harbor with a cloaked ship and set the Philadelphia on fire. This action was admired in Europe and made Deckard a national hero. In addition to the naval operations, there was also a rare land war. A small American force, supported by mercenaries, marched from Egypt to Derna in Libya in 1805. The success of this expedition contributed to Tripoli's eventual peace. But piracy was not finally defeated. In the Second Barbary War in 1815, after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the U.S. Navy intervened again. This time she performed with far more strength. Under Stephen Deckard, an American fleet struck swift and decisive blows against Algiers and Tunis. The Barbary states were forced to abandon the practice of tributes once and for all and to release American prisoners. This ended a decades-long threat to trade in the Mediterranean. These early conflicts had several important consequences. First, they showed that the U.S. was capable of acting militarily even far from its shores. For the first time, the Navy emerged as a global power that could assert its interests in the Mediterranean. Secondly, the victories over France and the Barbaresques shaped the Navy's self-image as a powerful and daring armed force. The names of officers such as John Barry, Richard Dale, and Stephen Deckard became legends. Third, this period created a tradition in which the Navy not only played a defensive role, but actively contributed to securing trade and freedom. The early years of the U.S. Navy were thus a time of learning, experimentation, and growth. Improvised beginnings became a fleet that was taken seriously. Even though she remained small in number, she proved through courage, discipline, and technical superiority that she had a future. Chapter 4. The Navy in the War of 1812 against Great Britain. The War of 1812 against Great Britain is considered one of the most important early tests for the United States Navy. While the land forces of the young republic suffered defeats in many battles, the Navy succeeded in strengthening national self-confidence through spectacular victories and establishing its reputation as a serious naval power. The causes of the war lay mainly in British policy during the Napoleonic Wars. Britain imposed trade blockades on France and controlled transatlantic traffic. American ships were repeatedly seized by the Royal Navy, and American sailors fell victim to the so-called practice of impressment. They were forcibly forced into the service of the Royal Navy, often under the pretext that they were deserters of British origin. These encroachments on U.S. sovereignty outraged the public and contributed significantly to President James Madison's declaration of war in 1812. The starting position was very uneven. The Royal Navy was the most powerful fleet in the world with over 600 warships, while the U.S. Navy had just 16 seaworthy warships, including the famous Humphreys frigates. Nevertheless, the Navy relied on the quality of its ships and the determination of its officers. Spectacular successes were already achieved at the beginning of the war. On 19 August 1812, the USS Constitution under Captain Isaac Hull defeated the British frigate HMS Guerrière. The Constitution was able to show off its superior firepower and robust planks made of American oak. When the British cannonballs bounced off her hull, she was nicknamed the Old Ironsides, which makes her famous to this day. This victory triggered storms of enthusiasm in the USA and gave the Navy an enormous moral upgrade. Further successes followed. The USS United States under Stephen Decatur defeated the HMS Macedonian. The USS Constitution achieved another triumph over the HMS Java, and the USS Hornet defeated the British HMS Peacock. Although these victories were militarily limited on a global scale, they had enormous symbolic significance. They showed that the Royal Navy was not invincible and gave the Americans a much-needed sense of achievement in an otherwise costly war. In addition to the individual successes of the frigates, the Navy also played a decisive role on the Great Lakes. Since control of the lakes was strategically important, both sides built fleets in the inland waters. The Battle of Lake Erie on September 10, 1813, became particularly famous. The American commander Oliver Hazard Perry led a small fleet against the British and won a decisive victory. His report, "We have met the enemy and they are ours," became a common saying. This victory secured the Americans' control of Lake Erie and allowed them to advance into Canadian territory. There were also battles on Lake Ontario and Lake Champlain. Although these were often drawn, but they tied up British forces and prevented complete British dominance. The Battle of Lake Champlain in September 1814, in which Commander Thomas Macdonough defeated the British, was particularly significant. It forced the British to break off their advance into the northeast of the USA. While the Navy celebrated respectable successes at sea, the situation on land was less glamorous. British troops burned down Washington in 1814, including the Capitol and the White House. But the successful defense of Baltimore, accompanied by the shelling of Fort McHenry, inspired Francis Scott Key to write what would later become the U.S. national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. The importance of the Navy in the War of 1812 can hardly be overestimated. Although the USA could not seriously threaten British naval power, the unexpected victories of its frigates strengthened the nation's self-confidence. The Humphreys frigates had proven that their concept was successful. More heavily armed and more robust than British ships of the same size, they could hold on in single battles. The war ended in 1815 with the Treaty of Ghent, which confirmed the pre-war borders, but did not settle any of the central issues, such as the practice of impressment. Nevertheless, the war was understood by many Americans as a second war of independence that had asserted the young nation against Great Britain. The Navy emerged stronger from the conflict. Their victories had proven that the United States could also hold its own at sea, and they laid the foundation for the further expansion of the fleet. Another important effect was the newfound respect abroad. European powers had to recognize that the United States not only had a powerful army, but also a powerful navy. At the same time, it became clear that the nation's future was closely linked to the sea. Trade, expansion, and security could only be guaranteed by a strong navy. Thus, the War of 1812 marked a turning point. A small, often controversial fleet had become a recognized naval force. The legends of old Ironsides, Perry on Lake Erie, and Decatur on the high seas shaped the self-image of a navy that was to be a permanent part of American identity from now on. Chapter 5: Expansion and Technological Development in the 19th Century. After the War of 1812, the U.S. Navy had consolidated its reputation, but the road to lasting naval power was still long. In the first half of the 19th century, the fleet experienced a period of slow but steady expansion, accompanied by significant technological changes. Steam power, iron hulls, and new weapon systems fundamentally changed the image of seafaring. For the United States Navy, this meant a constant balancing act between tradition and innovation, between tight budgets and growing demands. Immediately after the war, the Navy continued its role in protecting trade. It remained particularly present in the Mediterranean in order to curb piracy once and for all. The victory in the Second Barbary War in 1815 had strengthened the position of the United States, and the Navy had since held squadrons in the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. This was the first time that the U.S. Navy was permanently stationed worldwide and flew the flag in distant regions. A central element of this expansion were the so-called squadrons, small fleet formations that operated in different regions. The Mediterranean Squadron, the Pacific Squadron, and later the East India Squadron marked a beginning of a global presence. These ships served not only military purposes, but also diplomacy. They protected American consulates, supported trading houses, and demonstrated power at a time when gunboats often tipped the scales in negotiations. A milestone was the expedition of Commodore Matthew Perry to Japan in 1853-54. With a fleet of steamships, he forced the Tokugawa shogunate to conclude trade treaties with the USA. This opening of Japan was not only of enormous importance for world politics, but also a testament to the Navy's growing reach. At the same time, technology changed fundamentally. The sailing ships that had shaped the Navy since its inception were reaching their limits. From the 1820s onwards, the use of steam power began. Initially, steamships were seen as aids, but soon paddle steamers and later screw steamers became established. The Navy experimented with ships such as the USS Princeton, 1843, which was considered one of the first deep-sea frigates with screw propulsion. However, the introduction of steam power was expensive. Many politicians in Congress distrusted the new technology and stuck to the proven gliders. But the advantages, independence from the wind, higher maneuverability, were not to be overlooked. By the middle of the 19th century, a mixed fleet was created, which included both sailors and steamships. Armament also continued to develop. Instead of smooth guns that fired bullets, rifled guns were increasingly used, which offered greater range and accuracy. However, the explosion of the USS Princeton in 1844 during a demonstration, when a new type of gun exploded and killed several high-ranking politicians, also showed the risks of these technical innovations. During this time, the Navy also played an important role in American conflicts. During the Mexican-American War, 1846-1848, she blockaded ports, supported landing operations, and played a decisive role in bringing California under American control. Naval operations such as the occupation of Veracruz showed how important naval power was for the territorial expansion of the United States. The training of officers also became more professional. In 1845, the United States Naval Academy was founded in Annapolis, Maryland. Until then, officers had mostly been trained through practical experience on ships. The Academy was the first systematic training course that combined navigation, tactics, engineering, and discipline. Annapolis soon became the centerpiece of officer training and shaped generations of naval leaders. Another step in the expansion was the Africa Station, where the Navy took action against the slave trade. After the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, American ships patrolled the West African coast to intercept illegal transports. Although these missions often had limited success, they symbolized the moral and political aspirations of the United States in the world. The Navy of the early 19th century was thus an instrument of foreign policy, expansion, and trade protection. Although it was still far from the dimensions of the Royal Navy, it developed structures that enabled its later growth, permanent squadrons abroad, professional training, and the introduction of new technologies. The decisive challenge remained the balancing act between scarce financial resources and high expectations. Congress has often been reluctant to approve large budgets for the Navy. Many politicians saw coastal defense and the Army as more important. Nevertheless, the Navy managed to expand its presence and modernize it step by step. The first half of the 19th century can be characterized as a phase of slow but steady growth for the U.S. Navy. From a small fleet primarily responsible for trade defense, it developed into a globally present force that already operated in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. At the same time, it began to take advantage of the technological revolution of steam power and prepare for the next great conflict, the Civil War. Chapter 6. The Navy in the Mexican-American War. The Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 was a pivotal moment for the United States, not only territorially, but also for the development of the U.S. Navy. While on land, the Army, with generals such as Winfield Scott and Zachary Taylor, achieved the military successes, it was the Navy that secured supplies, carried out blockades, and enabled operations that accelerated victory. The war clearly showed that naval power was an integral part of American expansion. The causes of the war lay in the territorial expansion of the USA. The annexation of Texas in 1845 led to tensions with Mexico, which continued to consider the area its territory. When fighting broke out on the border, President James K. Polk declared war on Mexico. It was clear early on that the U.S. Navy would play a key role. Mexico had only a weak fleet, while the U.S. could use its ships to block ports and support troop movements. From the beginning, the Navy implemented a comprehensive blockade strategy. Mexican ports on the Gulf of Mexico have been blocked, including Tampico, Veracruz, and other major commercial centers. These blockades cut Mexico off from international trade and weakened its economy. At the same time, the U.S. Navy prevented supplies or support from outside from getting in. One of the most significant operations was the invasion of Veracruz in March 1847, with Admiral David Conner leading the Navy while General Winfield Scott was in command on land. With the support of more than 60 warships and transport ships, a large-scale amphibious landing was carried out, the first in U.S. history. Around 12,000 soldiers were landed on the coast, supported by artillery from the ships. The siege of Veracruz ended with the capitulation of the city, and it served as a springboard for the advance on Mexico City. This interplay of land and naval forces later became the model for future U.S. operations. The Navy was also active in the Pacific. The Pacific Squadron under Commodore John D. Sloat and later Robert Stockton occupied California. As early as 1846, the important ports of Monterey, San Francisco, and San Diego were brought under control. Together with the so-called Bear Flag Revolt of the American settlers, California was quickly brought into American hands, a decisive step for the later westward expansion. Another spectacular operation was the capture of Mazatlan and Guaymas on the Pacific. With the support of the Navy, American troops were able to eliminate the Mexican defenders and occupy the ports. Control of Baja California was particularly important as it strengthened the American presence in the Pacific. While the war was relatively short, it left important lessons. On the one hand, it showed how effective a well-planned blockade could be. The Mexican ports were soon cut off from the outside world, and the supply of weapons and ammunition collapsed. On the other hand, it became clear how important amphibious operations could be for American warfare. The landing at Veracruz was a strategic masterpiece that served as a model in later wars, from Cuba in 1898 to Normandy in 1944. The war was also a testing ground for the new steam technology. Although sailing ships still dominated, steamships such as the USS Princeton were used on a limited basis for the first time. This already hinted at the transition to a new era. In addition, the war was a training ground for officers who would later play a decisive role in the Civil War, including David Farragut, who gained experience as a young officer. Politically, the war had enormous consequences. With the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, the USA gained huge territories: California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, as well as parts of Colorado and Wyoming. This completed the expansion to the Pacific, and the Navy won the task of protecting a double coast, the Atlantic and the Pacific. For the Navy itself, the war meant a gain in prestige. It had shown that it was capable not only of protecting trade, but of actively shaping military operations, capturing ports, and showing a global presence. The combination of blockades, landing operations, and support for ground troops shaped a new self-image that went far beyond mere coastal defense. At the same time, however, the war also revealed weaknesses. The Navy was still small in number and could only expand its operations to a limited extent. Many ships were obsolete, and reliance on sails was a structural problem. The experience in Mexico therefore accelerated the discussion about modernization and strengthened the voices in favor of a stronger steam fleet. In retrospect, the Mexican-American War was a decisive step for the U.S. Navy from defensive coastal protection to a projecting naval power that could actively operate in foreign waters. The conquest of California and the operations in the Gulf of Mexico would hardly have been possible without the Navy. It had proven itself as an instrument of national expansion, and at the same time pointed the way to a future in which control of the oceans was becoming increasingly important. Chapter 7: Civil War, the Union's Naval Blockade, and the Struggle of the Ironclads. The American Civil War from 1861 to 1865 was not only a conflict between northern and southern states, but also a turning point in military and technological history. For the U.S. Navy, it was a formidable challenge, but also an opportunity to raise its influence and importance to a new level. The war was marked by a massive expansion of the fleet, a consistent blockade strategy, and revolutionary technological innovations that changed seafaring forever. When the war began, the U.S. Navy consisted of just about 90 ships, many of which were obsolete or stationed abroad. With the secession of the southern states, the newly founded Confederacy took over numerous shipyards, arsenals, and even some warships. However, President Abraham Lincoln and his administration quickly realized that the sea was the Confederacy's crucial weak point. The South was dependent on the export of cotton and the import of weapons, equipment, and industrial goods. With a strong blockade, the Union was able to strangle the economies of the southern states. This is how the so-called Anaconda Plan was born, a strategy based on a comprehensive naval blockade of the South. The Confederacy's coastline was over 5,000 kilometers long and included numerous ports and estuaries. To block them, the Union Navy had to build a fleet of unprecedented size. Within a few years, the number of ships grew to over 600, an unprecedented expansion. The blockade fleet consisted of a mixture of steamships, converted merchant ships, and new warships built specifically for this task. The blockade quickly had an effect. Although blockade runners, especially fast steamers from Great Britain, repeatedly succeeded in exporting cotton and smuggling in weapons, the losses were high. The blockade drastically reduced exports from the southern states and weakened their economies in the long term. Particularly decisive was the capture of strategically important ports such as New Orleans in 1862 by Admiral David Farragut, whose famous order, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead," became legendary in the Battle of Mobile Bay in 1864. In addition to the blockade, the control of the rivers also played a key role. The Union Navy deployed so-called riverine forces, naval formations that operated on the Mississippi and its tributaries. With armored gunboats, the so-called pook turtles, the Union managed to penetrate deep into the hinterland, cut off supply lines, and encircle cities like Vicksburg. Control of the Mississippi River divided the Confederacy and was a crucial step on the road to victory. The Civil War also brought a technological revolution, the use of ironclads. Until then, warships were mainly wooden sailors or steamships with wooden hulls. The Confederacy relied on innovation because it was outnumbered. She converted the captured warship USS Merrimack into an armored ramming ship, which became famous under the name CSS Virginia. In March 1862, she attacked the blockade fleet at Hampton Roads and sank several wooden ships almost invulnerable. However, the Union had developed its own armored ship in parallel, the USS Monitor, a revolutionary low-profile ship with a rotating turret. On March 9, 1862, the legendary duel between Monitor and Virginia took place, the first battle between two armored ships in history. The battle ended in a draw, but it marked the beginning of a new era. Wooden ships were finally obsolete. The future belonged to armored warships with steam propulsion. In addition to the ironclads, other innovations were also experimented with. The Confederacy used submarines, including the famous CSS Hunley, which sank an enemy ship, the USS Housatonic, for the first time in 1864. Even though the Hunley itself sank shortly afterwards, this was the beginning of underwater warfare. Mines, then called torpedoes, were also used on a large scale and posed a serious threat. The officers and sailors of the Union Navy gained valuable experience during these years. Men like David Farragut, David Dixon Porter, and Andrew Foote shaped the new generation of naval leaders. They combined traditional seamanship with modern technology and aggressive tactics. The war impressively showed that the sea could decide the outcome of land wars. Without the blockade, without control of the Mississippi, and without the mobility of the Navy, the victory of the Union would hardly have been possible. The Navy proved to be a strategic factor that isolated the Confederacy from the outside and divided it from the inside. By the end of the war, the U.S. Navy had become the largest fleet in the world after the Royal Navy. However, the rapid expansion was primarily due to the war, and after 1865, another decline followed. Many ships were decommissioned, budgets were cut, and the Navy fell back into stagnation for a few decades. But the experiences of the Civil War, blockades, amphibious operations, river warfare, and ironclads were to shape future developments and lead the Navy on the path to becoming a modern naval power. Chapter 8. After the Civil War, Decline and Reconstruction. After the end of the Civil War in 1865, the U.S. Navy was at the height of its previous size. With more than 600 ships, including numerous steamers and some experimental armored ships, it was the second largest fleet in the world in terms of numbers, surpassed only by the Royal Navy. But this status was not to last. The following decades were marked by a creeping decline in which the Navy was severely neglected before a new modernization push began at the end of the 19th century. The immediate reason for the decline was the political and economic realities after the war. The Union had invested enormous resources in victory, and after 1865, the priority was clearly on rebuilding the South and integrating the former Confederation. Many politicians saw no need for a large fleet, which caused high maintenance costs in peacetime. Congress drastically cut budgets, and most of the ships were retired, sold, or scrapped. Particularly problematic was the fact that the Navy was in danger of losing touch with technological development during this time. While European powers such as Great Britain, France, and later Germany and Japan systematically upgraded their fleets with modern steel-hulled ships, faster engines, and heavy guns, the USA stuck to an outdated fleet. Most Navy ships in the 1870s were either old wooden sailing ships or steamships with limited range and weak armament. This state of affairs earned the fleet the derisive nickname Old Navy, a navy that was at best suitable for coastal defense, but could hardly play a global role. This was particularly embarrassing in diplomatic crises, such as when American merchant ships in Asia or Latin America were threatened, and the Navy did not have the clout to intervene effectively. Despite this weakness, the Navy remained active and gained important experience in minor conflicts. In the 1870s, there were operations against pirates and insurgencies in the Caribbean and Asia. In 1871, for example, the Navy conducted an expedition against Korea after American ships had been attacked. Although these actions were limited, they made it clear that the United States wanted to defend its interests far from home. The real turning point came in the 1880s with the beginning of the reconstruction of the fleet. Prompted by a growing discussion about the importance of naval power in the modern world, the realization gradually prevailed that the United States could not remain permanently isolated. Trade, expansion, and international politics required a strong navy. A central figure was the naval officer and theorist Alfred Thayer Mahan, whose work, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1890, emphasized the strategic importance of sea power. Mahan argued that great nations could only become world powers by building powerful fleets and controlling important sea routes. His ideas resonated widely in Congress, the public, and presidents such as Benjamin Harrison and Theodore Roosevelt. In 1883, Congress approved the construction of 4 modern steel warships, which became known as the ABC ships, Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, and the torpedo boat destroyer Dolphin. These marked the beginning of the so-called New Navy. Steel hulls were used instead of wood. The ships were equipped with modern steam engines and had more powerful guns. In the following years, the development accelerated. At the end of the 1880s and in the 1890s, cruisers, battleships, and torpedo boats were created that could compete with European standards. In particular, the introduction of coastal defense battleships and later ocean-going battleships showed that the United States claimed to be able to operate not only defensively but offensively. This reconstruction was not only a technical question, but also an expression of a changed self-image. The United States increasingly saw itself as an expanding power with interests in the Pacific and the Caribbean. The construction of the Panama Canal came into focus, as did the securing of trade routes to Asia. A powerful navy was indispensable for this. At the same time, training changed. The Naval Academy in Appomattox modernized its curriculum to prepare officers for the new technical and tactical challenges. Engineering knowledge, mechanical science, and strategy gained weight, and the Navy began to see itself as a professional organization with a clear doctrine. By the end of the 19th century, the Navy had evolved from a relic of wood and sails to a modern steam fleet made of steel. Although it was not yet at the level of the Royal Navy, it had regained contact with the great maritime powers. The way was now set for the next step, the rise to global power, which would see its breakthrough in the Spanish-American War of 1898. The period between the Civil War and the 1890s was thus a phase of deep decline, but also of renewal. The Old Navy, which barely extended beyond the coasts, became the New Navy, which laid claim to a worldwide presence. This change shaped the foundation on which the United States was able to build into a maritime superpower in the 20th century. Chapter 9. The Rise to the Modern Fleet in the Late 19th Century. The last decades of the 19th century marked a period of dynamic rise for the United States Navy. The new Navy, which had been rebuilt after the Civil War with steel hulls, steam engines, and modern guns, now developed into a fleet that was on its way to making the United States a global maritime power. This rise was closely linked to industrial progress, an expansive foreign policy, and the realization that controlling the oceans was synonymous with influence in the world. After the founding phase of the ABCD ships in the 1880s, the Navy consistently continued to expand its deep-sea fleet. New cruisers, armored cruisers, and battleships were built, equipped with modern rapid-fire cannons and improved engine propulsion. This development was influenced by the European arms race. Great Britain, France, and Germany were massively expanding their fleets at that time, and the USA did not want to be left out. A decisive factor for the rise was industrialization. American shipyards, engineers, and steel companies were able to quickly produce large quantities of modern warships. The invention of powerful steam turbines, improved screw drives, and thicker armor made it possible to build ships that were tactically superior and could operate on the world's oceans. At the same time, the strategic orientation of the Navy changed. The experience of the Civil War and the Mexico expeditions had shown that coastal protection alone was not enough. The U.S. needed a blue water navy, a fleet that could operate globally, protect merchant ships, and have a military presence in distant waters. This required not only new ships, but also new logistics. Coal stations, repair facilities, and ports were built along important trade routes. The Navy also relied on diplomatic missions to show presence. Cruisers and steamships were regularly dispatched to ports in the Caribbean, the Pacific, and East Asia. These so-called show-the-flag operations served to demonstrate American power, secure trade interests, and support diplomacy. Especially in Hawaii and the Far East, the USA gained increasing influence, which was later to become decisive for economic and military operations. A key event in the consolidation of this power was the modernization of training and officer cadres. The Naval Academy in Annapolis had now integrated not only traditional seamanship, but also mechanical engineering, artillery knowledge, and strategic planning into the curriculum. This created a new generation of officers who were both technically adept and tactically trained, a prerequisite for the effective use of the modern fleet. The social perception of the Navy also changed. The American public, which had little connection to the Navy during the Civil War and the post-war period, increasingly began to see the fleet as a symbol of national strength. Press reports of maneuvers, flag flying, and diplomatic operations strengthened national consciousness and prepared the ground for political support in Congress. A particularly visible demonstration of the new strength was the Great White Fleet, 1907 to 1909, which later began its circumnavigation of the world under President Theodore Roosevelt. Although this fleet was just outside the time frame of the late 19th century, the plans and concept were already being developed in the 1890s. It showed the world not only the clout of American ships, but also the ability to operate globally, a clear signal of the growing importance of the United States as a world power. Technologically, the Navy increasingly relied on armor, heavy artillery, and steam propulsion, while wooden ships were finally scrapped. The introduction of rapid-fire cannons, improved torpedoes, and better armored battleships marked the transition from the post-Civil War fleet to a modern ocean-going fleet. These developments were necessary to keep up with European fleets and to be taken seriously in international waters. In addition, the Navy had a decisive influence on American foreign policy. The presence of the fleet in the Caribbean and the Pacific contributed to securing trade routes, colonial interests, and diplomatic influence. The U.S. developed a policy that increasingly relied on the projection of power by naval forces, a philosophy that was later put into practice under Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. Overall, the late 19th century marked the transition of the U.S. Navy from a regionally limited, defensively oriented fleet to a globally operating power. Building modern ships, improving training, expanding logistics capabilities, and strategic planning laid the groundwork for the challenges ahead. The Spanish-American War of 1898, control of the Pacific, and the projection of American power across the world's oceans. The Navy had thus consolidated its place in American society, in politics, and on the global stage. What had once been a neglected defensive instrument had become a fleet that increasingly demonstrated self-confidence, technical superiority, and strategic foresight, qualities that would make it an essential element of American world politics in the decades that followed. Chapter 10. The Spanish-American War of 1898 and the Birth of a World Power. The Spanish-American War of 1898 marked a crucial turning point for the United States and the U.S. Navy in particular. After decades of slow construction and modernization, the fleet was able to demonstrate its clout on the global stage for the first time. The war was short but effective and established the United States as a new maritime world power. The causes of the war lay in both economic and political factors. Cuba, a Spanish colony, had been in a struggle for independence since the 1860s. The U.S. had both economic interests and humanitarian motives to support the uprising. The explosion of the American warship USS Maine in the port of Havana in February 1898, the cause of which is still disputed today, was presented by the American press as a provocation by Spain and triggered a wave of national outrage. Shortly thereafter, President William McKinley declared war on Spain. The Navy played a central role from the beginning. It had to monitor the Spanish fleet in the Atlantic and the Caribbean, carry out the coastal blockade of Cuba, and support the Army's landing operations. At this time, the modern fleet of the USA was already equipped with steel hulls, steam propulsion, and heavy guns. This gave her a decisive advantage over the outdated Spanish ships, which were still partly made of wood and technologically inferior. The first and most famous battle took place in Manila Bay in the Philippines. Under the command of Commodore George Dewey, the U.S. Philippine Fleet encountered the Spanish Asiatic Fleet under Admiral Patricio Montojo on May 1, 1898. In a surprisingly one-sided battle, the Spanish ships were destroyed within a few hours without the U.S. troops suffering any significant losses. Dewey's victory showed the effectiveness of modern American warships and the importance of training, tactics, and technical superiority. The Navy thus secured the way for later U.S. colonial rule in the Philippines. At the same time, the fleet operated in the Caribbean. The blockade of Santiago de Cuba was decisive in imprisoning the Spanish fleet. In July 1898, the Battle of Santiago took place, in which the U.S. Navy under Admiral William Sampson defeated the Spanish Caribbean fleet. All Spanish ships were either destroyed or captured. This success demonstrated the strategic importance of the blockade and consolidated American control over the sea routes. The Navy also supported the landing operations in Cuba, especially the capture of Guantanamo Bay and later the Battle of San Juan Hill. With its ability to transport troops quickly and provide them with fire support, it made a decisive contribution to the victory of the American ground forces. The combination of naval forces and Marines represented an early form of modern amphibious warfare, which was later standardized and further developed. In addition to the military successes, the war also had strategic and political consequences. With the Treaty of Paris in 1898, Spain ceded control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The USA thus gained its first comprehensive colonial possession over the Pacific and the Caribbean. The Navy had made this expansion possible and thus established the status of the USA as a global power. The war also demonstrated the importance of fleet modernization and technical superiority. Steam power, armor, and modern artillery had tipped the scales. At the same time, the importance of a well-trained naval officer class became clear, a realization that had a lasting influence on the Naval Academy in Annapolis and naval research. Another effect was the increasing acceptance of the Navy by the American public. After decades in which it was considered more of a necessary but expensive instrument of coastal defense, it was now seen as a symbol of national strength and expansion. The victories in Manila and Santiago added to the pride of the young nation and legitimized the idea that the U.S. should be a maritime superpower. The Navy's successes during the Spanish-American War also prepared the ground for future operations in the Pacific, especially the control of the Philippines, the securing of trade routes to Asia, and the later establishment of naval bases such as Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The United States now had a fleet that could not only defend nationally, but operate globally. Overall, the War of 1898 marked the birth of the U.S. Navy as a world power. What had previously been a regionally limited fleet had become an instrument of global projection. The Navy had proven its effectiveness, organization, and strategic importance. The experiences and victories of this period shaped the American Navy for the 20th century, when it would play a central role in the global power projection in conflicts such as World War I, World War II, and beyond. Chapter 11. The Great White Fleet and the Theodore Roosevelt Era. The turn-of-the-century period marked a decisive high point in the rise of the U.S. Navy. After the successful Spanish-American War of 1898, it had become clear that the United States was no longer just a regional power. President Theodore Roosevelt recognized the strategic importance of a strong, modern Navy and used it as an instrument of diplomacy, power projection, and national identity. An outstanding symbol of this policy was the famous Great White Fleet, which sailed around the world between 1907 and 1909. The idea behind the Great White Fleet was both politically and strategically motivated. Roosevelt wanted to demonstrate that the U.S. was able to have a global presence and defend its interests worldwide. At the same time, the fleet was intended to act as a deterrent signal to potential adversaries, especially Japan, which was increasingly becoming a rising naval power in the Pacific. The fleet consisted of 16 battleships, all painted white, a sign of purity, power, and superiority, and supported by an escort fleet of cruisers and supply ships. The ships were modern, with steel hulls, rapid-fire cannons, and steam propulsion. They represented the technical pinnacle of seafaring at the time. Each ship was a symbol of the industrial capacity of the United States and of the ability to quickly and efficiently transform resources into a global fleet.
The fleet included not only the latest battleships, but also the best officers who had been systematically trained for global operations. The circumnavigation of the fleet was not a purely symbolic act. The ships covered over 43,000 nautical miles, visiting ports in the Caribbean, along the east coast of South America, in the Pacific region, in Australia, Japan, and finally back to the U.S. East Coast. During this voyage, extensive maneuvers were carried out to test the tactical and logistical capabilities of the Navy. The aim was to perfect navigation over long distances, the coordination of squadron movements, and supplies at sea. The fleet received special attention in Japan. The American presence showed that the U.S. was willing and able to protect its interests in the Pacific. This had diplomatic effect. Japan recognized that the United States had the means to pose a military threat and had to respect American expansion in the Pacific region. The voyage thus served not only military purposes, but was also a strategic instrument of foreign policy. Roosevelt's service to the Navy went beyond circumnavigation. He advocated a massive fleet modernization, which included the expansion of battleships, cruisers, and torpedo boats. At the same time, he expanded the training facilities, strengthened the Naval Academy, and promoted scientific research. Roosevelt understood that technological innovation, strategy, and training had to go hand in hand to create modern naval power. The political impact of the Great White Fleet was enormous. In the USA, the Navy became a symbol of national strength and pride. The fleet showed that the United States was ready to play on the global stage and that it had the means to advance its interests everywhere. At the same time, Roosevelt sent a signal to conservative politicians in Congress. The Navy was no longer a luxury project, but an indispensable instrument of national security. The voyage of the Great White Fleet also had long-term strategic effects. It laid the foundation for the Navy's later operations in World War I and World War II. The experience of coordinating fleets over long distances, organizing logistics for long missions, and efficiently deploying modern warships proved invaluable in the decades to come. In addition, the fleet helped to secure lasting public support for a strong Navy, a decisive factor that enabled the USA to become a global maritime power in the 20th century. In addition, Roosevelt influenced the strategic doctrine of the Navy. He relied on a continuous presence, technology offensive, and global projection, basic principles that still shape the American Navy today. The Navy was no longer seen as a defensive instrument, but as an active tool of foreign policy that could secure political and economic interests worldwide. In summary, the Theodore Roosevelt era took the U.S. Navy to a new level. The Great White Fleet symbolized not only the technical and tactical capability of the fleet, but also its strategic relevance for the United States as an emerging world power. Modernization, training, global presence, and political support during this period provided the foundation on which the Navy was able to consolidate its role as one of the world's leading naval forces in the 20th century.
Chapter 12. The Navy in World War I. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, the U.S. Navy was a modernized, globally present naval force that had been built up under President Theodore Roosevelt and his successors. After years of modernization, training, and global presence through projects such as the Great White Fleet, the fleet has now been able to demonstrate its effectiveness in a European conflict for the first time. The war was a test of the Navy's organization, technology, and tactics, and laid the foundation for its role as a world power in the 20th century. The U.S. entered the war in 1917 after Germany declared unrestricted submarine warfare and threatened American ships. The protection of merchant ships and the securing of Atlantic transport thus became the primary task of the Navy. German U-boats, the so-called U-boats, posed a serious threat to Allied and American trade routes. The challenge was enormous. The U.S. Navy had to combine conventional naval forces, convoy warships, and new tactics to reduce submarine danger.
A central component of the American strategy was the escort of transport ships by destroyers and convoys. American destroyers patrolled the U.S. East Coast and the North Atlantic, escorted merchant ships, and secured the crossings to France. These convoys were crucial for supplying the Entente powers with troops, supplies, and weapons. Without the Navy, the logistical connection across the Atlantic would have been severely endangered. Parallel to the Atlantic operation, the Navy developed anti-submarine techniques. Sonar devices, mines, depth charges, and strategic patrols were introduced to fight the German U-boats. The U.S. Navy worked closely with British and French allies to secure the Atlantic. This cooperation was crucial in reducing casualties and demonstrated the Navy's ability to operate multinationally. In addition to anti-submarine warfare, the Navy also played an active offensive role. American ships patrolled European waters, monitored German warships, and supported amphibious operations on the Western Front. While the U.S. Army's ground troops fought most of the fighting, the Navy was indispensable for the rapid crossing of the Atlantic and the securing of supply lines. Another important aspect was the training and organization. In the decades before, the Navy had developed a highly professional officer class that was trained in both technology and tactics. This made it possible to effectively deploy state-of-the-art warships and implement innovative concepts such as convoy escort or coordinated patrols. The Navy's technological advances, which had been introduced in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, were now paying off. Steel hulls, steam propulsion, and rapid-fire cannons made it possible to carry out operations in the open sea and over long distances. The Navy was thus able to play a significant role in controlling maritime trade routes without the European allies having to bear the entire burden of naval operations. The Navy's involvement in World War I also had a lasting political effect. It demonstrated the ability of the U.S. to act globally and cemented the Navy's status as a crucial instrument of national power. The experience also showed the need to focus on technological innovations and to continuously expand the fleet. After the war, the Navy played a crucial role in transporting troops and supplies back to the United States. Several 100,000 American soldiers were safely repatriated across the Atlantic, a logistical masterpiece that demonstrated the Navy's capabilities. The First World War thus consolidated the position of the U.S. Navy as a modern, global naval force. It had not only demonstrated strategic control over important sea routes, but also demonstrated its ability for international cooperation, technical innovation, and logistical feat. These experiences laid the foundation for the Navy's continued rise in the interwar period and World War II, when it would finally consolidate its role as the dominant maritime superpower.
Chapter 13. The Interwar Period, Disarmament Treaties, and Technical Innovations. The period between the end of World War I in 1918 and the beginning of World War II in 1939 was an era of consolidation, technological experimentation, and strategic realignment for the U.S. Navy. On the one hand, international disarmament treaties led to massive restrictions, and on the other hand, the Navy used the relative peacetime to develop new concepts, weapon systems, and ship types. This phase prepared the United States for its later role as a global superpower in the Pacific and Atlantic. In the immediate aftermath of World War I, the U.S. Navy faced a new international order. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 was intended to prevent an arms race between the maritime powers and set ton size caps for battleships and aircraft carriers. For the U.S., this meant that the fleet was limited in the number of capital ships, while the Royal Navy, the Japanese Navy, and other powers accepted similar restrictions. Despite this limitation, the treaty provided an opportunity for the United States to focus on quality, technology, and mobility. The Navy used the disarmament phase to test technological innovations. Aircraft carriers, which had been used experimentally for the first time during the First World War, now received targeted funding. The USS Langley, commissioned in 1922, was the first American aircraft carrier ship and served as a test platform for tactics, takeoff and landing procedures, and the integration of air operations into fleet strategy. These developments were to be decisive in the Second World War. Communication and sensor technology have also been modernized. Radio technology, improved targeting systems, and early radar experiments enabled better coordination of large fleet formations and the early detection of threats. At the same time, the Navy began to deal intensively with submarines. Both offensive and defensive concepts were developed to control the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The experience of World War I had shown that submarines could threaten trade routes, and the Navy was preparing to neutralize similar threats in the future. At the same time, the Navy focused on constructive innovation in ship design. Faster cruisers, versatile destroyers, and new battleships were planned, which were to be more powerful despite disarmament limits. Engineers and naval officers experimented with new armor, gun types, and propulsion systems. This period of research and development laid the foundation for the superiority that the U.S. Navy would achieve in World War II. However, the disarmament treaties also had political implications. Many politicians viewed the Navy as an expensive luxury, and budget resources were limited. The Navy therefore had to prioritize and focused on modernizing existing ships, building aircraft carriers, and training officers. At the same time, lessons were learned from the First World War. Logistics, rapid response, and the ability to operate globally had to be central components of the strategy. The training and doctrine were intensively developed during this phase. The Naval Academy in Annapolis, as well as other educational institutions, relied on a curriculum that combined tactics, strategy, engineering, and air operations. The Navy regularly tested new concepts in fleet maneuvers to test both technical and tactical capabilities. A decisive strategic change was the turn towards the Pacific. With the acquisition of the Philippines after the Spanish-American War, the Navy had permanent bases in the Western Pacific for the first time. The geopolitical importance of the region grew, especially in light of Japan's rise. The Navy began to target ships, bases, and aircraft carriers towards the Pacific to ensure a presence in this increasingly contested area. The interwar period was thus characterized by a twofold approach. Disarmament treaties limited quantitatively, while qualitative and technological advances were made. Aircraft carriers, submarines, cruisers, and destroyers were tested and tactically integrated. Logistics, communication, and training were given priority. The Navy learned that it is not the number of ships that is decisive, but their operational capability, modernity, and flexibility. At the end of the 1930s, the U.S. Navy was not yet at the level of a world fleet, but the course for the future had been set. The experience of the disarmament phase, technological modernization, and strategic planning laid the foundation for the United States to have a technically superior and globally operating fleet when it entered World War II. The Navy had learned that quality over quantity, innovation over quantity, and strategic foresight over short-term austerity were decisive. These insights shaped the American Navy in the second half of the 20th century and made it one of the leading naval forces in the world.
Chapter 14. The Navy in World War II, Pacific War against Japan. The Second World War presented the U.S. Navy with its greatest challenge to date. In the Pacific in particular, the United States had to compete against the Empire of Japan, which had a highly developed navy and had conquered large areas in Southeast Asia and the Pacific early in the war. The Navy, which had been modernized since the First World War, was faced with the task of stopping this expansion, securing trade routes, reconquering archipelagos, and finally decisively defeating the Japanese Navy. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, took the U.S. Navy and the entire American population by surprise. Japan attacked the Pacific Fleet of the United States and sank or damaged several battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Despite the losses, the aircraft carriers, which at that time were still operating outside the port, survived, which would later prove crucial. The attack led to the immediate entry of the United States into the war and marked the beginning of a global conflict in which the Navy played a key role. At the beginning of the Pacific War, the strategic task of the U.S. Navy was clear: to control the sea routes and protect the supply lines between the USA and the distant theaters of war. The Pacific region stretched for thousands of kilometers, and only a mobilized, flexible fleet could supply American troops and defend them against Japanese operations. The Navy relied on a combination of aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines that operated in coordination with each other. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 was the first major naval battle fought exclusively with aircraft from aircraft carriers. Although the battle ended in a draw, it stopped the Japanese advance towards Australia and demonstrated the central importance of the Air Force at sea. A few weeks later, in June 1942, the Navy won the Battle of Midway. Under the command of Admirals Chester Nimitz, Raymond Spruance, and Frank Jack Fletcher, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk. Midway is considered a turning point in the Pacific War, as Japan lost its strategic initiative and was hence forced onto the defensive. Parallel to these large-scale operations, the Navy carried out a strategic island-hopping strategy. The aim was to gradually isolate Japanese bases, secure important ports, and gradually advance towards Japan. Islands such as Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Iwo Jima were fiercely contested, with the Navy not only landing the troops but also providing fire support and keeping supply lines open. These operations were technically demanding and required close cooperation between the fleet, Marines, and Air Forces. Another key to success was the submarine war against Japan. American submarines attacked the empire's merchant and supply ships, severely weakening the Japanese economy and its military logistics. The sinking of hundreds of cargo ships meant that Japan was increasingly isolated and could no longer sustain its military operations in the long term. The Navy also used new technologies and tactics. Radar, sonar, improved torpedoes, and aircraft carrier fleets enabled more precise warfare. The integration of air and naval forces proved to be a decisive advantage over the Japanese Navy, which had traditionally relied on battleships and direct confrontation. The U.S. Navy also played a central role in the invasions of Japan's home territory. Operations such as landing Okinawa and supporting the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were made possible by the Navy's control of the sea routes and air superiority. Without the fleet, the projection of power across the Pacific would have been impossible. At the end of the Pacific War, the Navy was the decisive force that had made the United States the dominant naval power in the Pacific. It had defeated the Japanese Navy, gained control of the main sea routes, and laid the foundation for the post-war order. The experiences of the Second World War not only shaped the tactical and strategic doctrine, but also consolidated the Navy's self-image as a global superpower. The U.S. Navy's successes in the Pacific show how critical technology, training, flexibility, and strategic thinking are to the success of a modern fleet. Aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines worked together for the first time in an unprecedented coordination which allowed the Navy to secure its dominance at sea. World War II definitively confirmed that the United States Navy was not just a national defense force, but an instrument of global power projection as important in peacetime as it is in war.
Chapter 15, Atlantic Operations, D-Day, and Victory over Germany. While the Pacific War was in the public eye, the U.S. Navy also played a decisive role in the Atlantic. The threat from the German Navy, especially the Wehrmacht submarine force, made the Atlantic a critical area of operations. The security of transatlantic links was crucial for transporting troops, supplies, and war material to Europe, and the Navy developed a variety of strategies to ensure Allied superiority at sea. At the beginning of the Second World War, German submarines had a devastating effect. The so-called wolf packs attacked Allied convoys and sank thousands of merchant ships. The U.S. reacted hesitantly at first, as it had not officially entered the war until December 1941. But even before that, American ships were armed and escorted to secure supplies for the British. After entering the war, the Navy intensified its operations and worked closely with the Royal Navy. A central element was the convoy escort. Destroyers, cruisers, and submarines escorted merchant ships, protected them from attack, and coordinated the movement across the North Atlantic. For the first time, modern technology such as radar, sonar, and radio communication was used on a large scale. The so-called hunter-killer strategy made it possible to actively hunt down German U-boats and contain their threat. These measures were crucial to the success of the Allies and guaranteed that supply routes remained open. The Navy also played a central role in the preparation and execution of D-Day on June 6, 1944. The Normandy landings were one of the largest amphibious operations in history and required close cooperation between land, air, and naval forces. The U.S. Navy transported hundreds of thousands of soldiers, supplied artillery fire to support the landing troops, and secured the flanks of the invasion coast. This operation demonstrated the Navy's ability to conduct a complex, multinationally coordinated campaign. In addition to providing direct support for the landings, the Navy also participated in supporting the Allied bombing offensive over Germany. Aircraft carriers, some of which operated in the Atlantic, enabled airstrikes on German coastal targets and troop concentrations. At the same time, mine layers supported fleet security and prevented the deployment of German warships. A decisive contribution of the Navy was the support of special operations and amphibious landings in Italy, southern France, and Norway. These operations required precise coordination, logistical feats, and the use of state-of-the-art vessels. Battleships provided fire support, destroyers secured the convoys, and amphibious transports brought the ground troops directly to the beaches. The alliance between the U.S. Navy, the Royal Navy, and the Canadian Navy was crucial to victory in the Atlantic. The joint operations and standardized training made it possible to successfully carry out the invasions and secure the sea routes. The experiences in the Atlantic also laid the foundations for the Navy's post-war doctrine, which relied on a global presence, technological superiority, and close cooperation with allies. The victory over Germany in 1945 was not only due to the Army and Air Forces. The Navy had made a decisive contribution to ensuring the supply of the Allied forces, neutralizing German U-boats, and successfully conducting amphibious operations. Without the control of the sea routes, D-Day and the rapid advance through Western Europe would hardly have been possible. The operations in the Atlantic showed once again that the U.S. Navy was indispensable, not only as an offensive force, but also as a strategic tool of supply and logistics. The ability to safely transport large quantities of soldiers and material across the ocean was a decisive factor in the success of the Allies. By the end of World War II, the U.S. Navy had consolidated its role as a global maritime power in both the Pacific and the Atlantic. It had shown that it could operate on all oceans, use modern technology effectively, and perform complex, coordinated operations. The experience of the Atlantic War and the successes in D-Day and other amphibious landings had a lasting impact on the Navy's strategic and tactical doctrine for the decades that followed. The Navy had developed from a coastal protection instrument of the 19th century to a decisive global power projection. It was now not only militarily superior, but also capable of securing the political and economic interests of the United States worldwide. The Atlantic War had definitively proven that the U.S. Navy was a central force of American foreign policy whose influence extended far beyond national borders.
Chapter 16: Post-War Period and Beginning of the Cold War. After the end of World War II in 1945, the U.S. Navy was at a historic turning point. The war had established the United States as the dominant naval power on all oceans, and the Navy now had an unparalleled fleet of aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. At the same time, the geopolitical landscape changed fundamentally.
The Soviet Union had risen to become the new rival superpower, and the global order began to split into two blocks. The Navy now had to ensure not only warfare, but also deterrence, presence, and rapid response capability in a new era of the Cold War. The immediate post-war period was marked by massive upheaval. Numerous warships were retired, battleships were decommissioned, and the fleet temporarily shrank as Congress sought to reduce the enormous war spending. But the U.S. retained a core of modern aircraft carriers and submarines, the strategic importance of which was recognized. These ships formed the basis of a globally operating navy, which was to be decisive during the Cold War. A central aspect was the technologization of the fleet. The Second World War had shown the importance of aircraft carriers and submarines. The Navy now increasingly relied on nuclear-powered submarines, which could serve both as a strategic deterrent and as a projection of power. The launch of the USS Nautilus in 1954, the world's first nuclear-powered submarine, revolutionized the submarine force. With unlimited range and high speed, the Navy could now permanently monitor and secure the Atlantic, Pacific, and oceans. The Navy played a central role in building alliances and a global presence. As part of NATO, founded in 1949, American ships regularly operated in the North Atlantic to secure access to Europe and monitor the Soviet threat. This presence was of enormous importance not only militarily, but also politically. It demonstrated American determination to defend Europe and push through global power projects. At the same time, the Navy concentrated on the Pacific region. With the growing tensions between the USA and the Soviet Union, as well as the threat from communist states in Asia, especially China after 1949, aircraft carriers, naval bases, and amphibious forces were repositioned. The bases in Japan, the Philippines, and Hawaii formed the backbone of the American presence in the Western Pacific. Another strategic focus was nuclear deterrence. Nuclear-powered ships and submarines made the Navy a crucial part of the American doctrine of massive retaliation. Aircraft carriers were modernized, and the fleet was capable of deploying nuclear and conventional forces worldwide. This development made the Navy a key player in the early phase of the Cold War. The Navy also played a crucial role in post-war conflicts, which were smaller but strategically important. During the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, the Navy secured landing operations, transported troops, and supported airstrikes against North Korean and Chinese troops. The amphibious operations at Incheon, led by General Douglas MacArthur, would not have been possible without the support of the Navy. Aircraft carriers provided direct air support, destroyers secured the coasts, and transports made it possible to quickly relocate troops. The Navy also proved indispensable in the Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975. The fleet conducted coastal patrols, supported ground troops with artillery fire from the sea, transported units along the coasts, and used aircraft carriers to fly airstrikes deep inland. The experience of these conflicts solidified the doctrine of the global projection of power that had developed in the Navy since World War II. At the same time, the Navy modernized its training and organization. The Naval Academy, the officer schools, and the research institutions have been further developed to meet the new technological requirements. Electronics, radar, missile defense, and nuclear technology became central components of the training. The Navy now saw itself not only as a naval force, but as a highly developed organization that could operate globally and use state-of-the-art technology effectively. The strategic presence of the U.S. Navy during the early phase of the Cold War sent a clear signal. The United States was not willing to give up its global influence, and the Navy was the central instrument to ensure power projection, deterrence, and rapid response capability in a new era of the Cold War. Overall, the post-war period marked the transition of the U.S. Navy from the global war fleet of World War II to a permanent superpower fleet.
The Navy now was able to maintain its presence worldwide, use technological superiority, and intervene decisively in political crises. It was a symbol of American strength, a guarantor of global security, and an instrument of strategic power project that made the United States the world's leading maritime power during the Cold War and beyond.
Chapter 17: Korea, Vietnam, and the Navy as an instrument of global power projection. The period from the 1950s to the 1970s presented the U.S. Navy with new challenges. The global tensions of the Cold War, coupled with regional conflicts in Asia, required a flexible, technologically superior fleet that was not only able to respond to open naval battles, but also acted as a projection force on land operations. The conflicts in Korea and Vietnam clearly showed how crucial the Navy had become to the global power projection of the United States. In the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, the Navy played a key role. After the invasion of South Korea by North Korean troops in June 1950, the United States had to react quickly to support the South Korean government. The amphibious operations that allowed troops to land in Incheon were technically and tactically groundbreaking. Aircraft carriers provided air support for the ground forces, while destroyers secured the coasts and kept supply routes open. The Navy thus enabled the rapid deployment of troops, which favored the strategic turn of the war. The lessons from Korea were clear. Aircraft carriers, fast amphibious transport, and the ability to operate worldwide made the Navy a central instrument of American military strategy. The Navy no longer saw itself as a defensive naval force, but as an active power projection that could be used globally. In the 1960s, this role was further expanded during the Vietnam War. Vietnam's geographical features, long coastlines, river networks, and dense jungles made amphibious operations and coastal control essential. The Navy carried out the so-called Operation Market Time to prevent the Viet Cong's supply over the coast. Destroyers, patrol boats, and aircraft carriers monitored the South Vietnamese coast and supported both ground troops and airstrikes deep inland. The aircraft carriers became one of the most important instruments. They made it possible to attack targets deep in the hinterland without having to rely on foreign bases. This mobile air power could be flexibly deployed, allowing the U.S. to continuously maintain its power projection. At the same time, the presence of the fleet demonstrated the ability to influence conflicts from a distance, a feature that was crucial to the doctrine of global deterrence during the Cold War. At the same time, the Navy increasingly relied on technological innovations. The introduction of helicopters aboard amphibious landing ships, precision bombs, radar and communication systems, and submarine-launched missiles significantly expanded tactical possibilities. The experience from Korea and Vietnam served as the basis for the modernization of the fleet and the development of new tactics that would remain relevant in the later conflicts. The conflicts also highlighted the strategic importance of the global presence. The Navy was able to quickly move its forces from the East to the West Pacific, sending diplomatic signals and conducting military operations. Ports in Japan, the Philippines, and Guam served as logistical bases, allowing for the permanent deployment of aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines. The Navy had thus become a central lever of American foreign policy. In addition, the Navy strengthened the integration of allied and multinational operations. During the Korean War, the U.S. Navy operated closely with South Korean, British, Australian, and Canadian forces. This cooperation became a model for later coalition operations in the Vietnam War and in the global deployment of the Navy during the Cold War. During this period, a strategic principle was consolidated. The Navy was responsible not only for warfare at sea, but also for supporting land operations, securing trade routes, and the global projection of American power. It combined air, land, and naval forces in an integrated doctrine that became a central element of U.S. foreign policy. By the end of the 1970s, the Navy had consolidated its position as the leading maritime power.
The experience of Korea and Vietnam showed that a flexible, technologically superior fleet was able to influence regional conflicts, secure global interests, and support diplomatic objectives through military presence. The Navy had thus finally established itself as an instrument of global power projection whose significance went far beyond mere coastal defense. This phase laid the foundation for the modern Navy of the late 20th century, which continued to rely on aircraft carriers, submarines, amphibious operations, and technological superiority, elements that still form the backbone of American naval forces today.
Chapter 18. The U.S. Navy in the Late Cold War, Nuclear Submarines, Aircraft Carriers, and High Tech. In the second half of the Cold War, from the 1970s to the 1980s, the U.S. Navy developed into a technologically sophisticated and strategically versatile naval force. As the threat from the Soviet Union grew, the Navy consistently relied on nuclear submarines, aircraft carriers, and high-tech systems to ensure its dominance at sea and its global projection. This phase had a lasting impact on the Navy and made it a core instrument of American foreign policy. The threat of the Soviet Union was omnipresent. The Soviet Navy had massively expanded its submarine fleet, including nuclear-armed intercontinental submarines, fast fighter submarines, and cruiser formations. The U.S. had to respond to secure control of the Atlantic and Pacific, protect trade routes, and maintain strategic deterrence. To this end, the Navy developed a comprehensive concept of maritime superiority based on technological innovation, training, and a global presence. A central component was the expansion of the nuclear submarine fleet. Nuclear-powered submarines, especially those of the Los Angeles class and the later Ohio class, could operate underwater for months without having to surface. They were equipped with ballistic missiles, SLBMs, which served as a strategic deterrent. These submarines guaranteed that even in the event of a nuclear attack by the Soviet Union, the United States would have a second, indestructible strike force, a central component of the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. At the same time, the importance of aircraft carriers remained central. Carrier strike groups enabled the Navy to conduct air operations worldwide independently of land bases. Modernized aircraft, precision weapons, electronic surveillance systems, and radar technologies turned these units into mobile, hard-to-combat weapon systems. The ability to support troops, secure coastal operations, or project deterrence had thus been raised to a new level. The Navy also relied on high-tech systems for surveillance and defense. Radar, sonar, and electronic reconnaissance systems have been continuously improved in order to detect Soviet submarines, ships, and aircraft at an early stage. New weapon systems, including anti-ship missiles and long-range torpedoes, significantly increased the fleet's effectiveness. At the same time, the integration of computers and data processing into tactical planning began, which significantly improved response times and the precision of operations. Another strategic development was the focus on networks and coordination. Carrier strike groups, submarine patrols, cruisers, and destroyers increasingly operated in integrated formations that performed both offensive and defensive tasks. These groups could be deployed flexibly in different oceans and ensured that the Navy remained globally present and operational. The Navy also played a crucial role in regional conflicts and crises during this phase. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, it secured the blockade, quarantine against Soviet ships to prevent the stationing of nuclear missiles in Cuba. Later, during the Gulf War in the early 1990s, it projected precision forces out of the sea, supported land operations, and ensured control of important sea routes. The training of officers and the development of tactics and strategy were massively modernized during this period. The Naval Academy, research institutions, and naval commands integrated simulations, electronic warfare equipment, and tactical analysis into everyday training. This made the Navy an organization that could coordinate highly complex operations globally. Amphibious warfare was also a crucial component. Marines, supported by destroyers, amphibious transports, and air support, could be deployed quickly worldwide. This proved to be a central component of the strategy, not only in regional crises, but also in planning for an emergency against the Soviet Union. The late years of the Cold War clearly showed that the Navy was no longer a purely defensive instrument. It was a tool of global power projection that was technologically superior, tactically flexible, and strategically decisive. The combination of nuclear submarines, aircraft carriers, and high-tech systems made the U.S. Navy the undisputed dominant naval force in the world. By the end of the 1980s, just before the end of the Cold War, the Navy was fully globally operating, technologically superior, and strategically indispensable. It had proven its ability to act operationally and tactically flexibly, both on the high seas and in amphibious operations. The lessons of this period, technological innovation, global presence, deterrence, and flexible projection of power, shaped the U.S. Navy's structure, strategy, and self-image for decades to come. The U.S. Navy had thus finally become a core instrument of American foreign policy, whose clout and influence went far beyond national borders, and whose strategic importance in the 21st century was to remain unbroken.
Chapter 19. The Navy after 1990, Gulf War, Global War on Terror, New Missions. With the end of the Cold War in 1991, the strategic environment of the U.S. Navy changed fundamentally. The Soviet Union disintegrated, and the threat of a global superpower disappeared. At the same time, new challenges arose: regional conflicts, asymmetric warfare, international crises, and the protection of global trade routes. The Navy had to adapt, maintain its global presence, and integrate new technologies and flexible operational concepts. The Gulf War of 1990-1991 was the Navy's first major testing ground after the Cold War. When Iraq occupied Kuwait under Saddam Hussein, the U.S.-led coalition carried out a full-scale military operation. The Navy played a central role in this. It blockaded the Persian Gulf, conducted amphibious operations, supported ground troops with precise artillery fire from the sea, and used aircraft carriers as a platform for airstrikes. Carrier strike groups projected power, secured supplies, and ensured flexible responsiveness. In particular, the ability to conduct airstrikes from the sea showed the continued importance of aircraft carriers as a mobile airbase system. In the post-war period, the Navy increasingly applied its strategy to asymmetric threats, with piracy, terrorism, and regional conflicts requiring flexible and rapid response forces. The Navy ships patrolled important trade routes in the Persian Gulf, off East Africa, and in Asia. Amphibious forces and Marines have been used in crises such as the Somalia mission in the 1990s or in humanitarian missions such as the evacuation of civilians from crisis regions. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, the Navy was given a central role in the global war on terror. Aircraft carrier groups and amphibious formations were used worldwide to support operations in Afghanistan and later Iraq. The Navy provided air support, monitored sea routes, and ensured that troops and supplies could operate unhindered. At the same time, it participated in the fight against piracy off Somalia and in multinational counterterrorism patrols to ensure international trade and the security of shipping routes. Technologically, the Navy consistently continued its strategy of modernization. Nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and submarines remained the backbone of the fleet, while new destroyer classes such as the Arleigh-Burke class relied on precision weapons, radar technology, and integrated air defense. Unmanned systems, cyber operations, and network centricity were increasingly integrated into tactical planning, further expanding the fleet's ability to project power globally. The Navy also developed into a central player in the humanitarian and diplomatic dimensions. It supported evacuations, provided disaster relief after natural disasters, built infrastructure projects in crisis areas, and demonstrated the political presence of the United States. The Navy had expanded its role.
It was not only militarily dominant, but also an instrument of diplomacy, deterrence, and global stability. Another focus was the cooperation with international partners. Exercises with NATO forces, allies in Asia, and regional coalitions strengthened interoperability, enabled the exchange of technologies, and standardized operations. The Navy was thus able to react flexibly to regional crises while maintaining its global presence. Overall, the period after 1990 shows that the U.S. Navy has become a multifunctional force. It operates on all oceans, protects strategic trade routes, supports land operations, participates in global crisis management efforts, and projects power politically, economically, and militarily. Aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, destroyers, and amphibious means of transport form the backbone of this global capability. The experience of the last 3 decades makes it clear that the Navy has maintained its central role in the 21st century. It is no longer just a military force, but a key tool of American foreign policy, combining rapid responsiveness, technological superiority, and global presence. The post-war Navy shows that maritime power projection, strategic flexibility, and high-tech integration are critical to securing national interests in a globalized world. In the 21st century, the U.S. Navy has thus confirmed its historic role as the leading maritime superpower and further consolidated its position on the world's oceans. It remains the central instrument of the United States to secure security, stability, and influence at the global level.
Chapter 20. The U.S. Navy in the 21st Century, Rivalry with China, Modern Technologies, and Future Prospects. In the 21st century, the U.S. Navy is facing a new era of strategic challenges. While globalization has strengthened the world's economic and military interconnectedness, new geopolitical tensions have also emerged. In particular, the rivalry with China in the Indo-Pacific, the threat from non-state actors such as pirates or terrorist groups, and the need to secure global trade routes characterize the Navy's operational environment. At the same time, technological development is forcing the fleet to use state-of-the-art systems to maintain strategic superiority. China has invested massively in its Navy over the past 2 decades and has built up a blue water Navy. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, submarines, and amphibious units expand Beijing's ability to project military power over long distances. At the same time, China is pursuing aggressive claims in the South China Sea, especially on artificial islands and strategically important sea routes. The U.S. Navy is the central adversary here. It monitors international waters, protects trade routes, and conducts regular freedom of navigation operations to secure maritime order in the Indo-Pacific. The Navy relies heavily on technology and innovation during this period. Nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and submarines continue to form the backbone of the fleet, while modern destroyer classes such as the Arleigh Burke Flight III are equipped with sophisticated radar, precision missiles, and electronic defense systems. Unmanned systems, including drones for surveillance and attack, are integrated into tactical and strategic planning. Cyber operations and electronic warfare are now central components of operational planning. Another focus is on network centricity and multidimensional warfare. The Navy coordinates its operations closely with the Air Force, Space, and Cyber Commands, and international partners. The ability to process information in real time, detect threats early, and make quick decisions is critical to meeting the increasing complexity of modern conflicts. Parallel to the rivalry with China, the Navy remains globally present. It is involved in securing strategically important sea routes, such as in the Persian Gulf, along the trade routes to Africa and the Caribbean. Amphibious forces are used to support peacekeeping missions, evacuations, or humanitarian aid, while aircraft carriers serve as flexible platforms for power projection. This capacity for global projection is central to maintaining American interests worldwide. The Navy must also respond to asymmetric threats.
Piracy off the coast of Somalia, terrorism at sea, and threats to critical infrastructure pose new challenges. The Navy combines conventional naval forces with specialized units, surveillance systems, and multinational cooperation to neutralize these threats. This shows that the Navy today not only operates against state opponents, but also has to react flexibly to non-state actors. An important strategic component is training and technological adaptation. The Naval Academy, research institutions, and training centers integrate new technologies, simulations, and tactical scenarios into training. Officers must be well-versed in traditional warfare disciplines as well as high-tech warfare and cyber operations. This ensures that the Navy remains flexible, responsive, and technologically leading. The Navy of the 21st century is thus an instrument of American power projection that combines military strength, political signals, and diplomatic presence. It operates globally, protects trade routes, conducts amphibious operations, and uses high-tech systems for strategic deterrence. At the same time, it must continuously adapt to new geopolitical and technological conditions. The challenges of the future, especially rivalry with China, the advancement of unmanned systems, cyber warfare, and securing global trade routes, show that the Navy will continue to play a central role in American foreign policy. The experiences of the 20th century, from Korea and Vietnam to the Cold War and the Gulf War, form the foundation for a fleet that can operate globally and respond to all threat scenarios. At its core, the U.S. Navy remains a global superpower at sea, whose strength is based on technological innovation, training, logistical flexibility, and strategic foresight. It is not just a military instrument, but a symbol of American presence, influence, and security worldwide. The challenges of the 21st century will show how the Navy is evolving its historical role and asserting its dominance at sea, even in an increasingly multipolar world.